I love the Clone Wars. It's my favourite Star Wars, and the Bad Batch continues the stories that you get in the Clone Wars, so what's not to love with it? And with the new series on, I thought, I 3D printed these over a year ago and I spray painted them black. Maybe it's time I actually got around to painting them. These are by Dark Fire Designs, beautiful sculpts based on the original Clone Force 99, back when in the Clone Wars and perhaps the first season of the Bad Batch. Definitely not later on where they start to change their armour. So as a result, I painted them in the original colour scheme, which is black, grey, red and a little bit of white or brown thrown in there. Absolutely adore that colours. So dry brushing. I never used proper dry brushes before, and this is a set by Army Painter and I used the smallest one. Boy, do I love these. They're nice and soft and quite big, and they're beautiful to use. These were not expensive either. I bought them at my local shop. Now the trick is in the name, dry brushing. You want almost all the paint off. And if you can take it off on a surface that's not as absorbent, so it doesn't take the water out, it actually takes all of the paint out in the right consistency, you can get a really good effect, or so I'm told. So that's what I did. I think the big trick with this technique is not to be impatient and try and put too much on at once. I went with barely dark grey, and then I went with a slightly lighter, barely dark grey, so that I built it up. And each time I went lighter, I put slightly less paint on, so that I was catching more and more of the highlights in the edges and less of the actual body of the Mini, the flat plates. I added even more white and made a lighter grey and repeated the process for a third time. Now this is over the areas that are actually a dark grey armour, so I'm just getting it about the tone that I want it to be and starting to highlight out all of those edges and details to really give it some zap. But actually if you look at a picture of the Bad Batch, you'll see that they're animated, they're light around there anyway. It's just how it looks in the cartoon. But a quick look at the same picture and you'll see that armour is also incredibly scratched. So time to get out my scratchy brush. I suspect most of you have a brush like this. It's old, it's tatty, it's spread, it's useless, it's quite rough and coarse, and it's perfect for scratches. So even more white in that grey until I get a nice light grey, and I go over it all with scratches. Now the trick to adding realistic scratches, even if they are cartoon realism, is to not put too much paint on your brush, to put scratches onto the flat panels, but to bear in mind they're more likely to be worn and scratched towards the edges, so to concentrate on the edges just like you do with dry brushing. Weathering is definitely best built up in layers, and so again another coat of a lighter grey. You can see that it's quite a lot lighter, so just adding in so extra fine, not too heavy, additional lighter scratches. Now this is a fairly large brush going over delicate details, and it brings out the highlights really well, but it also sometimes goes into areas you want to be a different colour. But the good news is I can use something like speed paints. This is actually a black speed paint, thinned quite a bit to go over the darker areas, and then the highlights I've put on with my dry brushing will really show. This is actually the technique I use for almost everything that's left to paint, whether it's the black undersuits like here, where you just put a black over the top, or even just putting a thinner black or a grey over some parts of the armour where they're supposed to be a slightly darker grey than some of the other parts. If you feel that your armour is maybe a little bit too light, you can use it to just knock it back a bit. All in all, it's really powerful putting speed paints over this amazingly textured lower surface. However, there's one guy who likes to be different, and that's Tech, and he has a huge amount of brown on his armour. Now I came back and did this right at the end, so you might notice he's got some other colours on there as well, but I still just did it with a speed paint over the top of everything dry brushed, and it shows through beautifully with a brown speed paint too. time for the markings. And you can see there's reds, there's some black patches, and there's some white skulls. So starting off with the reds and blacks, I use speed paints because when I thin them and then put them over the existing scratched up armour, the scratches show through and it's really good effect. The poppy red I really loved. It's thinned and it's just painted on where I needed it. Now, doing this on the armour was okay because it's in pieces and generally it's a stripe down the middle. It's when you get to doing the helmets and some of the finer details that this becomes really important. Thankfully, StarWars.com has all of the Clone Wars and all of the animations. They have all the concept art and pages like this where they show you the armour so you can get a good idea of just where everything needs to go. Now, black and red on, but now it's time for white. Generally, white paint is quite opaque, and speed paints, if you're going to use them for white, they're just a grey. But I need tech to have whiter armour. So I also need to do some skulls and just generally white bits on some of the helmets and other areas. So for this, I decided to use just a really, really opaque white paint and thin it a lot. It still goes on like a glaze. I probably am not as white as perhaps I should have been, and sometimes I just built it up in various layers so that I didn't go too white and overwrite everything. Technically, I probably should have gone the other way around and put the white on and then scratched it back down with greys. I didn't though. I also used the white paint to clean up the markings on the helmets where they had obscure designs, and then also to add in some skulls. I didn't particularly go overboard on these. I put on a couple of black dots for or dark grey dots for the eyes, but there was no way I was going to outline them, and the 99s were often just representations of lines. I love clones. They're some of my favourite characters in Star Wars, but they are also brilliant for painting because they generally wear helmets. I cannot say how grateful I am that they wear helmets. Sadly though, I have one of each of the figures with a helmet under their arm, and I need a face for it. So I started off using Crusader skin to add on just a base coat, but I always find it looks a bit thin and translucent and weird, and it pulls darkly with a lot of saturation into the shadows. It's not how real faces are. So once I'd put on the base skin tone, let it dry, I then went through and just started to paint everything in properly. I really suck at faces, so I'm sorry. But first up, I painted the eyes. I do them with a white. I used a dark grey to put a line down the middle where the iris of the eye would be. Then I mixed Crusader skin and white together to get a flesh tone that has more body to it than just speed paint on its own. And I used that to touch up around the eyes and to just lighten the skin from the sort of disgusting colour it ended up, which was almost like a bright peach. I used a dilute brown actually to put some shadows in. It's a speed paint, and I just felt it added a little bit more depth into the hollows of the cheek without the sort of peachiness of the other colour. When that was dry, a bit of grey speed paint into the eyes just defined them maybe a little bit better. And I finally glazed the sort of paler skin colour back over the top, leaving it dark where I need it to be. This is a very thin coat of the white and Crusader skin, especially on people like Echo, who's a very pale colour. He really benefited from this kind of blotchier, slightly skin toning. Onto the home stretch. Now, I'd missed a few things, whether it was Tech's lenses, Wrecker's busted eye. I'd even forgotten Hunter's skull on his face. How can you forget that? But also the blue lights on the back and a few other details, some 99s, etc. that I'd missed. So I put all those on, and then I didn't want to glue the helmets on because these are going into dioramas, but I don't know which way they're going to be facing yet. There may be a good way for them to face. And I don't want to put the backpacks on either. So I decided they're all just blue tacked on, or poster tacked, or whatever you want to call it. They're all just tacked on for now, and I'll sort them properly. So if you see any dodgy helmets in the final photos, just gloss over that. They'll be fixed by the diorama. And with mentioning the final photos, it's time for them. But quickly before that, this is my next Kickstarter project. It's not coming out for a few months, and this is the first model of 8. I'm doing pod racing, galactic races they'll be called, and you can expect them out later this year. It is the 25th anniversary of the Phantom Menace, and I've been having great fun designing this. And now it really is time for those final photos. And it is a nightmare to get these to stand up. I promise you next time they will be in dioramas, but it's up to you what those dioramas are. I'm thinking swamp, snow, and I've got the ship from ZZM Armory. So they'll be probably the ones with the helmets in front of the ship. But if you want to see a different diorama, I've got 5 of some of the figures, so I can do at least 5 dioramas, maybe more if I do individuals. So if there's a particular scene you want to see, let me know and I'll think about doing it. Just put it in the comments below. Well, that's it for this video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button notification so you know when all the diorama videos come out. And if you enjoyed it, consider supporting me as a channel member or as a Patreon. Otherwise, see you next time.